Hello everybody and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex. In this week's episode, we're doing the Thunder Junction State of the Format Address episode. This is the one where I give you all my takes on the format. I break it down, tell you what's good, tell you what's not so good. As always on the State of the Format Address episodes, we're going to start big picture, and as we go through it, get more granular, more nitty gritty. I'm about 16 drafts into the format at this point, when you include like early access and a few paper drafts I've done, and of course all the just ladder drafts I've done. I think I have a pretty good idea what's going on, so let's just jump into it. So like I mentioned, we're going to start with the big picture here, the largest umbrellas of what I think is going on in the format, what I think you need to know. We'll then get into some archetypes, then we'll talk about some colors, and just cover some odds and ends as we get into it. And by the way, just a little bit of a meta conversation to start this State of the Format Address episode. I think what I'm going to do for each format going forward now, for the regular Limited Level Ups listeners out there, is I'm going to have two State of the Format Address episodes. One at the beginning, and one about halfway or 2/3 through. I think it just makes sense, right? The state of the format as it is when people are kind of just figuring out the cards, and just the straight up, hey, here are the good cards in the set. And then once the meta settles, once things kind of get figured out, what are some decks that you can now draft on week 4, 5, 6 of the format? I did that with Murders of Karlov Manor, and people really enjoyed that. Got a lot of good feedback on that. So yeah, stick around for, 5 weeks from now when we do another State of the Format Address episode. Anyway, so starting with what I am currently seeing as what's coloring the format for me, no pun intended, is the color green. Green's got a deep roster of commons. It's got a bunch of awesome uncommons. Most of its rares are also excellent too. And this is something that I've been saying previously on some of my other content. If you watched my pre-release video, this is a big thing I said, just like all the green rares are busted. And I think with maybe an exception or two, they're all like A-level rares. So you're going to find yourself in green or wanting to be in green a lot of the time just by virtue of opening a good green card. And then even still, I think a lot of the time, I found this to be true for myself, you get pushed into green, especially we're only a week into the format or less than a week into the format, because people don't know how good some of the green commons and uncommons are. The best uncommon in the format in my mind right now is Outcast to Greenblade. This is the 2 and a green 1/2 human mercenary that when it enters the battlefield, you look through your library for a basic land or a desert, reveal it, put into your hand, shuffle, and the Greenblade gets +1/+1 for each desert you control. This card's just excellent. It just does so many things. Fixes your mana, gives you card advantage, becomes a big threat if you've got deserts in your deck. And that's just like one of many. Like, I'm just picking this out. I think you could certainly argue for a few other uncommons that are very, very good too, but a lot of those uncommons are also green. Something like Spinewood's Armadillo, which is the 6 mana 7/7 Ward 3 Reach that you can pay 1 and a green to discard it to go get a basic land or a desert, put it into your hand, you gain 3 life. Or something like Beastbond Outcaster. This is the 3 mana 3/3 at uncommon that when it enters the battlefield, if you control a creature power 4 or greater, draw a card, plot for 1 and a green. Like, all these cards are excellent, and this is just the top of the list, right? Going to the commons as well. Right now, the top performing common in the format, if you're looking on 17 lands, is Throw from the Saddle. This is 1 and a green for a sorcery. Target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn, or you put a counter on it instead if it's a mount creature, and then it deals damage equal to its power to target creature you control. This is a 2 mana Hunt the Week a lot of the time, right? This card is very, very good, partially because the mount deck is pretty strong. This is one of the stronger synergies in the set, but just noting that this is a excellent removal spell, and like we're going to get to in a second, removal is quite good in this format. I think it's something you want to prioritize even more than some other formats. We're going to get into talking about green a little bit more once we get into the colors. I'm not going to go through every single green common that I like. That'll come in a few minutes. But just right now, while people don't know how good the color is, this is the week 1 thing. There's usually a week 1 thing in most formats. If you want to think about it, Murders of Karlov Manor, what was the week 1 thing? It was red-white aggro. If you think about LCI, Lost Caverns of Ixalan, that was like the Jeskai aggro kind of stuff going on. Now it's green. If you're drafting the format, week 1, week 2 of the format, I think this is where you want to be. Other decks are certainly draftable, but if I had my pick, I would just want to be in green. Now, as much as I like green, it's not head and shoulders above the next best color, which is black. And I do think black is also really strong as well. I know on Lords of Limited this past week, they actually had black as their top color. And I can definitely understand having black as your top color. It does offer quite a bit. There's a lot of good commons just like green. There's a lot of good uncommons. Not as many good rares, and I actually think with play boosters and more rares in packs, I actually think that's become a bigger part of the equation for evaluating how good a color is in Limited. Like, I really do think you should consider how good the rares are in a color when you're trying to figure out how good the color is. And some of the lesser colors in the set, you'll kind of notice, like red and blue, not to bury the lead or anything, but I think red and blue are some of the weaker colors, and they just don't have as many good rares. Now, they don't have as many good commons and uncommons either, but point stands. I think that rares are an important part of the puzzle. So yeah, black's got pretty good removal. It's got some kind of sneaky good commons as well in Ambush Gigapede and Fake Your Own Death. We're going to talk about those as we get a little bit deeper talking about the colors, but I just want to highlight that as much as I love green, and I think it is deeper than black, that's one thing to note. There's more good green cards than there are good black cards. I've been playing a lot of black as well, and it's definitely a color I'm happy to start with. And just quickly before we get to our next big picture point, I want to quickly shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. You can go there if you like the show, if you like what we're doing, if you want to support the show. The Patreon is the #1 thing that keeps this show running, so if you want to see more limited level ups, go check that out. There's a bunch of rewards that we want to give back to you if you want to support us, so please go check that out, and yeah, back to the show. All right, let's talk removal now. So I am the type of player who generally, in most limited formats, like to value good creatures over good removal spells. Because I'm of the opinion that these days, because the creatures are so good, you can generally get away with, 3, 2 removal spells in your deck. Maybe you're an aggro deck using combat tricks as your means of interaction, and you can get by, right? It's totally fine not to have too much interaction. I think people sometimes overvalue removal because you're like, oh, if they play some awesome bomb and I need to kill it. Bombs aren't always part of every single limited game, and I think people kind of over-index the times when they face a bomb. Let's just say you play a bomb in 1 out of every 6 games, 7 games. All right, well, you're going to be very happy to have 5, 6, 7 removal spells in your deck because that bomb is probably going to be dead. But most of the time, I think it's better in Modern Day Limited to be a bit more proactive. Now, that mindset got me into a lot of trouble this time around in Thunder Junction early on. I actually was not winning very much for my first few drafts of the format because I was drafting like I usually do, which is usually pretty successful for me, taking good creatures over the good removal spells. And I was ending up with like 1 or 2 removal spells in my deck. I don't think that works very well in this format because the rares are very good and there are a lot of them. A lot of very good must-answer rares. Now, that sounds very scary and sounds like the sign of a bad format, but I think the thing is, if you value removal pretty highly, and I'm aiming for about 5 or 6 removal spells in most of my decks, when your opponent does play a great card, it usually is answerable by a removal spell. And what I mean by that is there are some rares in some formats that either have hexproof or have some awesome protection ability or just generate infinite value when they enter the battlefield. In this format, most of the good rares, I'd say like 80% of them, maybe a little bit less, your opponent's going to play them, and if you have a removal spell, that's fine. You carry on with the game. If they untap with that creature once, they're going to pull far ahead, and if they keep that thing on the battlefield for multiple turns, they're probably going to win. But again, they're answerable. And as soon as I started valuing removal spells a bit higher, which is something that a lot of people already do, this might be something that you don't have to change. Maybe you're a drafter who often first picks removal spells instead of the high quality creatures. If that's you, then great. You don't have to change too much. But if you are somebody like me, and maybe you also were not winning that much in the early days of the format, just bump up where you take removal spells. Like I said, looking for 5 or 6 of them. I think often the games come down to a pretty critical turn when somebody plays a bomb. And the other thing is, even if you do draft those 5 or 6 removal spells, you do still want to be careful about when you're choosing to cast them. I almost look at the removal spells in this format as when I draft them, like they've got a rare's name on them already, right? I'm hoping to point this at a rare at some point. Now, I'm not saying never fire off for your removal spells. Sometimes you fall a little bit behind and you're just like, all right, I gotta cast my Desert Stew, my 2 mana instant, target creature gets -2/-2, and an additional -1 for each desert you control. Sometimes you're pretty far ahead and you want to keep pushing damage. I think that's okay too, as long as you think you're gonna win the game in a turn or two if things keep going the way they're going, and maybe you're attacking well enough that if they do play a bomb, it's not a huge deal. I'm still totally okay using my removal spell in combat if my opponent goes for a double block and I can get a 2-for-1. Like all those kind of game states, I'm totally fine firing them off. But if I just have a Mystical Tether, the 3 mana enchantment that's kind of an Oblivion Ring at common, and you can pay 2 more mana to flash it in, I'm not just going to cast this on their 4/4. Their Beaver, the 4 mana 4/4 mount creature that saddles for 3 to put a counter on the thing that mounted it. Like, that's a thing that, sure, if I think I just have no other way to deal with that thing and it's going to kill me, I'll fire it off. But I'm going to really make sure that I can't deal with that thing any other way before I use my precious removal spell. And by the way, the more removal you have, the more you're okay with firing off the first one, right? If you've got 3 removal spells in hand, sure, you're more okay just like killing a 4 mana 4/4. But if you just have 1 removal spell in hand, and maybe you didn't get 5, 6 removal spells, you only have those 3, I'm going to be very, very careful about where I fire them off. So just some specifics on removal quickly, going through some of the common removal spells. Throw from the saddle, like I mentioned, the bite spell in green that your creature gets a counter of its amount. That card, very, very strong. Not only does it kill most things, because the green creatures are quite big, but you get to push a little bit of damage, which is nice. The black removal spells are good. Consuming Ashes, the 2 black instant, exile target creature, and if it had mana value 3 or less, you surveil 2. Sometimes this 4 mana instant black removal spell slot isn't that good. It's a little bit clunky, but Consuming Ashes has been quite good. The exile definitely has been quite relevant. I mentioned Desert Stew a second ago. The 1 and a black instant, target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. An additional -1 for each desert you control. I also prioritize deserts pretty highly, so this is often a -4, -3 in the early game. Shoot the Sheriff. This is one I really want to touch on. This is the 1 and a black instant at uncommon. It says destroy target non-outlaw creature. And this has been a very controversial card. I've seen some people say, like, I never want to put this card in my deck. There's some people who say, no, it's totally fine. I'm more in the camp of it's totally fine. Because, yes, there are a lot of outlaws running around, but actually not a lot of the rares that are just like must kills are outlaws. Sure, there are some of them. You know, you can show me a handful of them and be like, look, these are outlaws, and I can't kill this thing. They're Laughing Jasper Flint, the 1 black-red 4/3 that draws cards off the top of your deck. Yeah, you have to kill that thing on the spot, and Shoot the Sheriff doesn't do it. But if I'm viewing removal in this format as this has a rare's name on it, and when I put it in my deck, then Shoot the Sheriff is going to be a really good card. And, you know, the thing is, you're going to face green-white sometimes, green-white mounts. Shoot the Sheriff's going to kill pretty much everything in their deck. Yes, sometimes you face black-red and it sits in your hand. I'm willing to pay that price, right? Especially because I don't think black-red is, like, one of the best decks in the format. It's a solid one, but it's not one that I'm like, well, that's just a deck you're going to face all the time, and it's really, really good. If my one spell in my deck doesn't line up well against one deck in a few spots, again, that's a price I'm willing to pay, and I do think Shoot the Sheriff's a good card. Mystical Tether, the 2 white enchantment that comes in exile as an artifact or a creature. White also has just, like, I think 7 Oblivion Ring style effects when you count the bonus sheet. White's got a lot of cards like this, and sometimes these get blown up. There is a decent amount of incidental enchantment removal in the set, so you got to be careful. You don't always go like, okay, well, I Mystical Tethered their creature and it's gone for good. Sometimes it's going to come back, but it's still a card I think you do really want to value highly. And so green, black, and white have good removal spells, and blue and red, which I do think are the worst colors in the format, one of their issues is their removal kind of sucks. You know, like blue doesn't generally get great removal. It's got Stop Cold, which is the 4 mana aura flash. It taps down an artifact or a creature. It loses all abilities. Like, it's serviceable. I have put this card in my deck and not felt horrendous about it, but it's nowhere near efficient or value generating as some of the other ones we just talked about. Blue's got counterspells as well, and we'll get into the blue counterspell deck as we get a little bit further into the episode. So the counterspells can sort of play that role, definitely, but as per usual, blue doesn't have a great reach out and kill that thing kind of card. And then red, one of red's issues is that its removal, which is usually pretty good, right? One of the draws into red in a lot of formats is it's got a shock variant. It's got a 2 mana deal 3. Red's removal spells are not very good in this format. So we've got Thunder Salvo, which is the 1 in a red instant at common. It deals X damage to target creature, where X is 2 plus the number of other spells you've cast this turn. This isn't a terrible card or anything, but you have to work for your deal 3. And mind you, sometimes it's not that hard to work for. You just have to cast one more spell, but it's a hoop you have to jump through. It doesn't kill many of the 4 or 5 mana rares that I'm looking to kill, so that's kind of a knock against red. And then its other removal spell at common, Trick Shot, 5 mana for an instant. It deals 6 damage to target creature and 2 damage to up to 1 target token creature. It kills most things, but at a very inefficient rate. 5 mana is just so much. So I do think red and blue are being dragged down by the fact that their interaction, which is such an important part of what makes a color good or what makes a deck good in this format, is really lacking in a lot of places. All right, my next big picture point is just talking about aggro decks in the format, and mostly talking about how there aren't many very good ones. So people, you got your wish. You were asking for a slower format where you don't just get run over. This is the one, or at very least you don't get run over by common 2-drops and 1-drops. The 2-drops at common in this set are not very good at attacking. Like white and red especially, which are the aggressive colors generally. Their 2-drops, well, number 1, red gets 1 2-drop, which is kind of just unheard of. It gets Deadeye Duelist, which is the 2 mana 1/3 reach that you can pay a mana and tap it to deal damage to somebody. So that's not a very aggressive card. It's a slow card. It is looking to end the game or go towards ending the game, but it's mostly a card you put in your deck to trigger your committing a crime cards. White also, it's got Sterling Keykeeper, which is a 2 mana 2/2 that pay 2 and tap it to tap target non-mount. Also, Outlaw Medic, 1 and a white for a 1/3 lifelink human rogue that when it dies, draw a card. I actually do like this card. It's a strong card, but not a very good card at attacking all that well early on. At least not one that's just gonna run your opponent over. Green, another point for green here. Green gets some of the better 2-drops in Bristlepack Sentry, which is the 2-mana 3/3 defender that can attack if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. Voracious Vermin is also kind of a solid one. 2 mana for a 2/2 Vigilance that you can pay 1 and sack the Vermin to destroy target artifact or enchantment. Not a aggressive card that attacks very well, but just a solid 2-drop. But when I think of a good aggressive 2-drop, the main thing I think of is it can attack well by itself without any help, without any tricks, without anything else, right? It has evasion, it has an ability that makes it difficult to block, it has first strike or something, and none of these cards have that, barring maybe the Bristlepack Sentry, which can attack as a 3/3 early. The other thing that kind of really puts a damper on aggro is there's a lot of things that just stop the aggro game plan. We've got something like Spinewood's Paladin, which is the 5 mana 5/4 in green that has plot for 3 in a green, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life. Your opponent does not want to see you even plot this card on turn 4 if they're trying to play an aggressive game plan. And there's also a bunch of tokens running around, a bunch of mercenary tokens. Prickly Pear, which is the 2 and a red 2/2 that enters with a mercenary token. This almost feels like more of a defensive card to me than an aggressive card. I mean, sure, the mercenaries help you to attack, and I think that's like the main way that your aggressive decks are attacking. It's just pumping your creatures various ways like the mercenary tokens. But if you're a proactive deck, you're not the kind of proactive deck that's like 2, 3, 4 combat trick, removal spell, kill you. Those curve outs just don't really exist unless you have some like really high rarity cards generally. Another pretty striking issue with the aggro decks in this format is there just is a distinct lack of combat tricks in the format. We've got Quick Draw, which is a single red mana instant. Target creature you control gets +1/+1 and first strike until end of turn. Your opponent's creatures lose first strike and double strike. Not a very good combat trick. We do have a good combat trick and Take Up the Shield, 1 and a white instant, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, it gains lifelink and indestructible until end of turn. But that's kind of it. There's Snakeskin Veil, but that's more of a protection spell than a combat trick. So the aggro decks are missing a key tool that they usually need to be successful in most formats. Now, the format is not completely devoid of aggro. It's not like you can't have a proactive deck. I've had pretty good proactive decks, but it's a pretty narrow band of good aggressive decks. So I think if you are drafting an aggressive deck, you're really looking at green-white, which is the green-white mount deck, and green-red, which just has giant creatures. Actually, both of these decks really kind of get a tailwind off the fact that green's creatures are very big and they attack very well naturally. I was just saying a second ago that a trademark of a good aggressive creature is that it attacks well by itself. It doesn't need any help. It doesn't need a combat trick, a pump spell, a removal spell. It gets in a few free hits by itself, and the green creatures, especially some of the bigger mounts, do that. I did leave out one good 2-drop until right now, just to kind of prove a point that the 2s don't attack very well. We do have a common 2-drop that does attack quite well in Trained Erranks. This is 1 and a white for a Cat Beast mount. It's a 3/1. It's got a saddle cost of 2, and when it attacks while saddled, it gains first strike until end of turn, scry 1. Yes, okay, you need another creature to saddle it, but that's okay. That's not, I don't really count that as like it needs help. You're gonna just be playing creatures on curve, right? It's gonna be able to attack as a first striking 3-power creature on turn 3 a lot of the time. So this is one you're looking for. The mount deck, like I mentioned, has some pretty beefy creatures, same with green-red. And I don't think that play pattern that you're usually used to of 2, 3, 4 combat trick attack, kill you on turn 6, is the way you're going to think about your aggressive decks. The way you want to think about your aggressive decks, from what I found, is it's a little more just play some stuff, hopefully with good enough power and toughness, just beefy power and toughness on turns 2 and turns 3. And then you find ways to keep getting those creatures in and make things annoying for your opponent. It's a little bit more of like an attrition-y aggro strategy, a little bit less of I'm just spending all of my mana, outspending you, getting under you, like you might come to expect from some other formats. So some cards that kind of highlight that are the mercenary tokens, for sure. One of the ways that you can keep attacking is just have a few mercenary tokens sitting around, keep pumping, pump your 2-drop, that gets in, pump your 3-drop. Your opponent keeps having to trade. Then the mercenary tokens, the more mercenaries you have, you can just go like, okay, I got 4 mercenaries. One of them's going to attack as a 4/1. Next turn, I'm attacking again as a 3/1. Oh, I drew another good creature. That thing's going to attack you for 7. So the mercenaries have really been good. They really have done their job for helping the aggressive decks attack. And then some cards I want to call out here that I think are a little bit underrated right now. Sterling Supplier. This is the 5 mana, 4 and a white, 3/4. It's got flying, and it says when it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on another target creature you control. So helps one of your creatures attack, helps one of your creatures attack past one of your opponent's things. Then you're left with a 3-power evasive creature. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, where it's just like, yeah, you're not necessarily just relying on the cheap things to get in by themselves. They need some help. They need something to pump their power. And here's another one that I like quite a bit. Stagecoach Security. This is 4 and a white for a 4/5, and when it enters the battlefield, creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain vigilance until end of turn. It's got a plot cost of 3 and a white. Yeah, this is another one that I found to be quite effective, either on curve, or maybe you hold it for a little bit, you plot it early, you just see how many creatures you can get in play, you got a bunch of tokens, and, you know, I've ended the game with this card quite a few times, so I don't think these are premium cards by any means, but they are cards that I'm willing to play in my 5-drop slot for these decks. And in some formats, I wouldn't even consider the 5-drop slot for my aggro decks, just like, who needs that? The 2s and the 3s are so good. A bunch of 1-drops. That's just not the case here. There's actually just not that many 1-drops in the format. Speaking of 1-drops, one I want to call out that actually I don't think is very good. This is one that I know a lot of people came in hot in. I was kind of like medium on, and I've actually even performed worse than I might have expected. Reckless Lackey. This is the single mana 1/2 first strike haste, and it has the ability 2 in a red to sacrifice it to draw a card, create a treasure. It just doesn't really do all that much. So I think a lot of people look at this card and they see a lot of words and it's like, wow, it does so many things. But I'm really looking for evasion on my 1-drop or 2 power on my 1-drop. There's a big difference in my mind between a 2-power 1-drop and a 1-power 1-drop, right? And yes, first strike kind of counts as evasion-ish. It works well with the mercenary tokens, but often what happens is you just play this, you get it for a hit, and then your opponent bricks it almost immediately, and because there aren't very many good combat tricks, you can't keep threatening attacks with this. Again, I think the best tool that aggressive decks have is just large creatures that are hard to block, and Reckless Lackey is not that. There are not that many ways to augment your creatures in this set naturally, aside from a few cards I just mentioned in mercenary tokens, and so the keyword of first strike just gets a little bit worse if it's just a 1-power first striker. Now, I'm not saying it's unplayable. I do think there are some decks that you have a lot of mercenaries. Yeah, it's going to keep getting in, but it's not just like, oh yeah, that's the 1-drop I want for my deck. I might play a copy or two. Two, I think, stretching it, right? I think I would prefer not to have this in most of my red decks, though. All right, and then the last big picture thing to talk about here before we get into some more specifics is just talking about the various lands that are in this set, because there are a lot of lands in the set, and we'll start with the Desert Duels, the ones that come in and deal your opponent a damage. These cards are good, and you should take them pretty highly. I've 3rd, 4th picked them out of, medium packs. I think that these cards do a lot of things for you, and you'll want them for a lot of reasons. Like, you don't mind taking them early, because I think it's rare that you end up in a deck where you don't have a use for them. Either you care about the fixing, or you care about it being a desert, or you care about the pinging damage because you're committing crimes. They just do so many little things for you. The one I prioritize the highest is the black-green one, Festering Gulch. I like the green ones in general, and I like the black ones in general, but the green-black one specifically, well, it's both of them together, and the reason green and black are so important are because they enable the 2 good common desert payoffs, Cactarantula, the 6-mana 6/5 reach that costs 1 less if you have a desert, and whenever an opponent targets this, you can draw a card, and Desert Stew, the 1 black -2 removal spell that scales for the number of deserts you have. Both these cards are very good. Both these cards are top commons. And if you can cast your Cactarantula on 5, if you can make Desert Stew a -4 or -3 early-ish in the game, those are pretty meaningful power level upgrades on those cards. And this is also just a set where splashing happens quite a bit. In my green decks, it's hard to have a green deck that you don't want to splash in. Usually, the strength of green in this set is that you do get to pick up a lot of good cards you see along the way. But even in non-green decks, like I've splashed quite a bit. I've had like a black-red splash white, kind of like Mardu Aristocracy deck. I don't think you need to be green to want to splash. To put some numbers to this, on 17 lands, these lands are right up there with the top performing commons. Like the black-green one specifically, like I mentioned, is like I think a top 10 common in the set right now. Now, that's partially reflecting that the black-green land will often go in black-green decks, and black-green are the 2 best colors, so, there's a little bit of chicken-egg going on there. But all the things I said, I think, still do stand. Some other lands here, Mirage Mesa, this is the desert that it comes in tapped, and you choose a color as it enters that it taps for. Card's also pretty good, although I do think this is a little bit worse than the Pinging Desert. Like, if I'm just to pack 1, pick 4, or pack 5, take a green or black desert, or Mirage Mesa, I'll probably take the green or black Pinging Desert. So I guess the order is like, specifically green-black desert, and then green or black desert, like a red-green one, for example, or a black-blue one, and then Mirage Mesa. And then around where I like Mirage Mesa, I like Conduit Pylons, which is the one that comes in and surveils 1, taps out a colorless, and filters your mana, 1 tap, add a mana of any color. I think a copy of this is quite good in any deck that's splashing, or any deck that's not splashing, just cares about deserts, like a land that comes in, surveils 1 that makes color at some point, even if you're paying a little bit of a tax. I think it's totally a fine card. And then we have 2 cards, one that has really exceeded my expectations, and one that has performed very poorly, or a card I have not wanted to put in my deck. So we'll start with the one that has exceeded my expectations, Bucolic Ranch. This is the uncommon desert. Taps to add a colorless, or it taps to add a mana of any color. Spend this only to cast mounts. And it also has 3 tap. Look at the top card of your library. If it's a mount card, you can reveal it, put it into your hand. And if you don't, you can put that card on the bottom of your library. This card is great. Part of this, of course, is that the mount deck is great, so a good land goes in a good deck, but that ability is really good, right? One of the things about green-white is that, you don't have as much grind as some of the other decks, and you do get into board stalls some amount of the time, right? It's not like the kind of aggro deck that, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, you're not just going to run over your opponent every single time, and having this as a way to kind of churn through the mid-game, just, even just scry 1 every turn for 3 mana. That's a pretty good deal. And I also don't think it's a card where it's like, okay, if I'm playing the mount deck, I'll put it in. I think you actively want this in the mount deck. Like, I think it is actually a good high pick if you know you're already there. And then a card that I've kind of started high on. It looks like cards of the past, but has just not been very good. Arid Archway. So this is the colorless desert. It enters the battlefield tapped, and you have to pick up another land when it enters the battlefield. If that land was a desert, you surveil 1, and it adds colorless. So this kind of card in the past has been pretty good. These lands that give you card advantage, right? Because they are 2 mana sources on 1 land. If you start with an opening hand with this and 1 other land, you have 3 mana sources, which is a positive. But I have not felt that outweighs this being a colorless land. And I actually heard a lot of different opinions on this card. There's some people I've heard are still like, yeah, really great card, even though it's colorless. Some are kind of on board with me where I think the colorless is too great of a cost. Maybe this is a function of the decks I've been playing. I have been playing a lot of green where you can't really afford a colorless land. I don't think this card is unplayable. Like, if you have a monocolored deck, yeah, you should play it. It's going to be a good card still. But I would not want to play this if I was, split on colors. I was a blue-black deck that was just split equal down the middle. I don't want to play it if I have any double pips on my deck. Like, I could imagine you playing it in a deck where you're just 2 colors, you have no double pips, like your cards are easy to cast. Then I could definitely consider it, especially if you have other deserts and care about committing crimes. Like, the thing that interests me about this card is, let's just, take that blue-black deck, for example. A blue-black deck that cares about committing crimes, or maybe red-black, the deck cares about committing crimes, I think, a little bit more than blue-black generally. So a red-black deck with easy-to-cast cards, and you've got a bunch of deserts that ping your opponent, and you're able to play this to pick up a desert to get another trigger to ping your opponent to commit more crimes. That's something that I am interested in, I think. I think that's kind of like the best use for the card, or like I said, just in a monocolored deck. This is one that I have gotten a lot of questions about recently. I had a draft video a few days ago that I just left it in the sideboard, didn't even mention it because in my mind I was like, no, I don't want to play this card. But so yeah, my stamp on this card right now is I don't think you should play this in the vast majority of your decks. Okay, let's get into some archetypes here. I'm going to give some kind of broad thoughts. Not going to go too deep on any of these decks right here, right now. I'm going to save that for some coming weeks. But I've got all of the signpost and commons in front of me for each of the color pairs. So I want to talk about the decks roughly in order of how good I think they are. There's some variation in here. This isn't a strict 1 to 10 ranking, but just where I'm seeing the decks right now, the strengths and the weaknesses of each one. Let's just start with what I think if I could sit down at a table and you said to me, you can pick one deck and you get a good version of this deck. What deck would I choose? I think it's probably green-white. Number 1, it has green cards, and you'll notice a trend. A lot of the top decks here, the ones I talk about first, are the green decks. So that's a big pull for sure. But number 2, the 2 signposts and commons, Miriam, Herd Whisperer, which is the green-white 3/2, that says your mounts and vehicles have hexproof on your turn. Whenever a mount or vehicle you control attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Very, very, very strong card. And Congregation Gryff, maybe even better. I actually do think this one's probably even better. This is 1 green-white for a 1/4 flying lifelink creature. It's a mount, of course. It's got saddle 3, and it says when it attacks while saddled, it gets +X until end of turn, where X is the number of mounts you control. So both these cards are awesome. It really helps that most of the mounts are just good cards, right? The Trained Arinx, like I mentioned, the 2-mana 3/1 that can gain First Strike. Giant Beaver, the 4-mana green 4/4 Vigilance that has saddle 3. Whenever you attack with the Beaver, you can put a +1/+1 counter on a creature that saddled it. Drover Grizzly is pretty solid. 3-mana 4/2 in green, saddle 1. When it attacks, your creatures get trample until end of turn. I think the one saddle at common that is not good is Bridled Bighorn. This is the 3 and a white 3/4 mount. It's got saddle 2. It has Vigilance, and when it attacks while saddled, create a 1/1 white sheep creature token. It's not a horrendous card, and I've played this card when I've got enough mount synergies, but I think the other ones are just quite a bit better. And there's a bunch of good uncommon mounts too, right? The Congregation Griff, like I mentioned, the gold card. But Rambling Possum's really nice. 3-mana 3/3 in green, saddle 1. Whenever it attacks while saddled, it gets +1/+2. And then you can return any number of creatures that saddled it to their owner's hand. So you get to like reset enter the battlefield effects or something like that. It is a way to grind. Attacking as a 4/5 is just really good. But another thing that Green White has going for it is it gets access to 2 of the better commons in the format, Snakeskin Veil and Take Up the Shield, the 2 protection spells, 1 in green, 1 in white. And I was just talking about how important removal is and how I think, as the format goes on, people are going to prioritize removal quite highly. These cards obviously just destroy removal. When your opponent casts a 4-mana removal spell and you have a Snakeskin Veil, it's just really terrible. Sometimes you catch your opponent completely off guard, and it's like, oh wow, I wasn't expecting that. But sometimes your opponent sniffs it out. Like, I've been in a lot of situations where I've sniffed out that my opponent has a Snakeskin Veil. I'm like, well, I just can't really do that much about it, right? Like, what am I supposed to do? So Green White's just the combination of good cards. It's a good proactive deck. It has green in it. It has these protection spells. It's pretty easy to draft. You don't need all these moving parts. You just need some solid creatures. So if you are just going into some of your first drafts of the format, I would not shy away from picking some of the gold cards, Congregation Griff and Miriam. There's also the green-white rare, the 2/2 First Strike lifelink that has saddle for 4. That when it attacks while saddled, you get a 3/3 flyer. That card's excellent as well. Just one of the best rares in the set. Yeah, can't really sing the praises of Green White high enough. Okay, next up is the deck that I've drafted the most so far, Green Black. I think this deck is also excellent. Green Black gets 3 signpost uncommons that are really good. Like, it gets the 2 main ones, of course, and then it gets Back for More. From the bonus sheet, which it plays very well into Green Black's theme. So Green Black is doing graveyard stuff. It's self-milling itself. It's doing some reanimation. It's buying things back from the grave. But the great thing is you can also just have a Green Black deck with good Green Black cards. Like, it doesn't have to be a graveyard-centric deck. You can just have a deck with the good cards in the format, which is really nice. So let's talk about these signposts. Honest Retstein, 1 black-green for a 3/2 uncommon. Legendary creature, Warlock, so it does have a little bit of synergy with any of the Outlaw stuff you have going on. Your creatures cost 1 less to cast, and when it enters the battlefield, you return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So just a fantastic limited magic card. Nothing wrong with this, right? Quite powerful. Badlands Revival, 5 mana for a sorcery, 3 black-green. Return up to 1 target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and then also 1 target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. So a little bit of card advantage, plus you get to reanimate something. And then Back for More, 6 mana, 4 black-green for an instant, again on the bonus sheet. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and when you do, it fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. And I think a lot of people on first read actually miss that this card is an instant. So you can get some really sick blowouts where you reanimate a giant thing, it fights something, it blocks something else. Really big fan of this card, especially this is one of the best cards for this deck, but also just one of the best uncommons in the set. Spinewood's Armadillo. I mentioned this one a little while ago, but it's the 6 mana 7/7 Reach Ward 3 in green. You can discard it by paying 1 in a green to go get a basic land card or a desert, put it in your hand, and gain 3 life. So what you do with the Spinewood Armadillo is you just discard it early on, go get a land, and you can just reanimate it with a Badlands Revival or a Back for More. There's also on the big bonus sheet, the 5 mana black 5/4 Menace, that it enters the battlefield and all creatures get -2/-2. It also has a similar ability to the Armadillo, but it's 1 in a black to discard it to give a creature -2/-2. And that's just like kind of does the same thing as the Armadillo. So I really found that the grinding that this deck does is really effective in the format. Patient Naturalist and Desperate Bloodseeker, two really good commons for these decks. Both of these self-mill. In the case of the Bloodseeker, it also targets your opponent for committing a crime if you care about that. The Bloodseeker is the 2-mana 2/2 lifelink. It enters and target player mills 2 cards. And the Naturalist is the 2 green 2/3 that enters the battlefield, mills 3 cards. You can take a land from among the milled cards, put into your hand, or if you didn't mill a land, you get a treasure token. Mourner's Surprise. This is one I want to call out. This is 1 and a black for a sorcery. You return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, and you make a 1/1 mercenary token. And this card's really strong. We've had this kind of effect before. I think in Brothers War was the last time we saw it, like a mini Gravedigger, basically. But since you are self-milling quite a bit, you get a lot of selection. This effect can sometimes be a little bit slow when you're paying 2 mana or any amount of mana to not affect the board, but that mercenary token really makes up for the fact. You can block with that. You can start attacking with it if you're ahead. And I just think that with all the self-mill you have in this deck, you do just get access to your best cards pretty frequently. Like, this deck is very consistent, not just because you hit your land drops with the Naturalist, but because you see your best cards with all the self-mill. You can get them back with Mourner's Surprise. Another premium uncommon that's good in any black deck, I think, but especially good in this deck is Hollow Marauder. 7 mana, 6 and a black for a 4/2 flyer at uncommon. It costs 1 less for each creature in your grave. And then when it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. And for each opponent who didn't discard a card with mana value 4 or greater, you draw a card. So if your opponent's empty-handed, you just draw a card. If your opponent discards a 3-drop or a land, you draw a card. And of course, this comes down for cheap in this deck pretty consistently. Also, buying it back from the graveyard, doing it a few times. You know, your opponent has to kill a 4/2 flyer generally because that thing's just going to kill them. Green-black's just the combo of good synergy and good cards. It's kind of it's the best of both worlds, right? Some decks in some formats are like, well, if you get all the synergy pieces, your deck's really good. But if you just have like blue and black cards and just from the set that don't really play that well together, your deck's not going to be very good. And there's sometimes where it's like, yeah, like this color pair is very good. You know, the 2 best colors in the set. Sure, these colors are going to play well together, but they don't really have synergy. They're just good cards. Green-black is both of them, which is what I think is one of the best things to be doing. And then just quickly, I want to touch on blue-green. And blue-green kind of has a bit more of like a plotting theme. Doc Orlock is one of the signposts uncommons here. Blue-green for a 2/3 Bear Druid that plotting costs 2 less. And also spells you cast from your grave or exile cost 2 less. And I found the issue with this is that you just can't really get that many plot cards. It's hard to get a density of them. I mean, they're scattered throughout the set, but there's not like a ton of them. So it's hard to get a actual mana advantage off this card. Like, often what I found you'll do is like you play Doc on 2, and then you like plot something on 3. But unless you have a 2-drop, like you plot a 3-mana plot card or a card that costs 3 to plot for 1 mana. But unless you also have a 2-drop, you're kind of like wasting that mana. And sometimes you really get lucky and you can plot 2 things right away. That's good. But I've just found this card has been kind of medium. There's Make Your Own Luck as the other blue-green signpost uncommon, which is a sorcery. Look at the top 3 cards of your library. Exile a non-land card from among them. That card becomes plotted, and then you draw the other 2 cards you looked at. Card is strong, right, for sure, but it doesn't really like add to blue-green's theme that much. I'm bringing them up when talking about blue-green. Mostly because I splash Make Your Own Luck or, just like green cards that aren't necessarily exactly black-green, green gold cards, or just, cards of any color, right? Like one of the things about black-green, I think, is that it's also a very good home for splashing because you're playing a slower game, you have time to find your mana, Patient Naturalist helps, the Armadillo helps if you have that too. So, while black-green is just good if you're just black and green, I also think it's one of my favorite homes for just multicolor splish-splashy stuff. Green-red is up next, and green-red is very what you see is what you get. It's got Cactus Folk Sure Shot, which is the 2 green-red 4/4 Reach Ward 2 plant mercenary that at the beginning of combat on your turn, other creatures you control with power 4 or greater gain trample and haste until end of turn. And Jolene, Plundering Pugilist. This is the 1 green-red 4/2 human mercenary that whenever you attack with 1 or more creatures power 4 or greater, you make a treasure token and you can pay 1 red to sacrifice a treasure. And Jolene deals 1 damage to any target. Both these cards are pretty good. Like I mentioned a few minutes ago, red-green's a pretty good aggro deck. Nothing too complicated going on here. I do like that all of the red-green 4-power matters payoffs are pretty good. For example, there's like the 3-mana 3/3 in red at uncommon that whenever you attack with it, if you have a 4-power creature, you get a 3/1 dinosaur. Like, that card's good. It's kind of like green-white in a way, where if you're trying to figure out how to draft this deck, you kind of just take the cards that do the thing they say. Like, you want a curve of good green-red creatures, you want some interaction, you want the 4-power payoffs. One of the simpler decks to draft, but definitely effective, right? Like, I have played this deck to good effect. I played against some really scary curve outs with this deck where the opponent just goes like, on turn 2, Alchemist, which is the 3/2 Trampler at uncommon that you can, like, when you plot it, a creature gets +3, +2 and trample into Jolene, into the Cactus Sure Shot, like, really just putting up a lot of power and toughness. So, yeah, I think this is a good iteration of the power 4 greater mattering stuff. Like, sometimes that stuff doesn't really work in red-green, but no, it's just a good aggro deck in this format. Red-black is an interesting one. We've got Vial Smasher, Gleeful Grenadier, which is red-black for a 3/2. It's a mercenary, and whenever an Outlaw enters the battlefield under your control, Vial Smasher deals 1 damage to target opponent, and at Knife Point, which is the 1 black-red enchantment that your Outlaws have first strike. Whenever you commit your first crime each turn, you get a mercenary token. So I've played red-black to reasonable success when it's been open. I think right now, though, it's very overdrafted. And not only have I not gotten into it very often, but you check on 17 lands just to see where people are taking these cards, and they're taking them, I guess I would say, higher than I would take them generally. I think people are overrating the Outlaw stuff a little bit, because that's what the set is about. Like, week 1, you're gonna have a lot of drafters that are just like, hey, what's happening in this set? Oh, it's about Outlaws. All right, I'll draft that. You know, how that happened with the detective deck in MKM. It happens basically in every set, where you get some drafters that maybe only draft 1 or 2 times per set, that just come in and go like, oh, okay, like, this is what the set's about. Let's draft this color pair. And I'm not saying this deck is bad or anything. I think it's one of the kind of more middle ones, but I think it's definitely fine when it's open. Just that right now, I have not found myself in it very much because, yeah, I just think it's a little bit overdrafted. I'll also say that while there are Outlaw payoffs, there's like Rakish Crew, the black enchantment that makes a mercenary, and then whenever one of your mercenary dies, you drain your opponent for 1. There's a few other things scattered around. I've actually found it's a bit more of like a committing a crime deck, kind of a spectrum, right? Like, you can definitely have a more aggressive deck where you're mercenary Outlaw focused, and you're just beating down. You've got there's the uncommon that has it's like a 5/4 trample that has affinity for Outlaws. Like, that thing's gigantic. But when I've played black red, it's been a bit more controlling using at knife points, the enchantment, where you don't really want at knife point that much in like an aggro deck, because you take a turn off, or at least you take part of a turn off to do not that much, and it takes time to accrue some value with this. I found at knife points a little more of like a control card rather than an aggro card. Which bleeds into blue-black, which is also like the really committing a crime deck. We've got Lazov, which is the 1 blue-black, 1/4 shapeshifter. Whenever you commit a crime, put a counter on Lazov, and you can exile a creature from a grave. Lazov becomes a copy until end of turn, and the Intimidation campaign, the 1 blue-black enchantment that your opponent loses a life, you gain a life, you draw a card, and whenever you commit a crime, you return this to its owner's hand. I've seen Sandblack go off quite a bit with this kind of like Grixis-y crime stuff. So I guess one of the things when thinking about red-black is just ask yourself where you are on the spectrum of, are you like an Outlaw focus deck, where you've got those aggressive cards, you've got Rakish Crew, you've got Vial Smasher, you're trying to end the game, or are you more focused on at knife point, maybe you're splashing blue for Intimidation campaign? In these kind of decks, I value the deserts really highly, because as a free committing a crime trigger. So there's definitely some room there to kind of explore. But like I said, I think right now these decks are a little bit overdrafted. And also blue-black, I'm kind of grouping in blue-black with blue-red here. Blue-black, its theme isn't supported that much at common. Like, there are a few things that care about when you commit a crime in blue, but they're not very good. Like, there's like the 1/4 vigilance that gets +2 whenever you commit a crime, and that card is just kind of stinky. There's also the Ravenfell Omens for this deck, which is the 1 in a black 1/2 flyer that whenever you commit a crime, each opponent loses a life and you gain a life. This is a card that I do think can be effective, but you really have to have a lot of crime stuff going on. Don't just put this in a black deck. Like, I never really want this in a black-green deck. You really have to put this in a black-blue or a black-red deck where you're getting a lot of triggers, you have a lot of removal, you have a lot of the crime deserts. If you're not triggering this every turn, I don't think you should put it in your deck. You have to really expect to trigger almost every turn. Then there's white-black, which has a really, really good uncommon and a not-so-good uncommon. So the really good one is Ruthless Lawbringer. 1 black-white for a 3/2 uncommon. It's an assassin, and when it enters the battlefield, you can sacrifice another creature, and when you do, destroy target non-land permanent. Card's very good. Card's very strong, especially if you've got Mourner's Surprise, which is the 1 in a black, buy something back from a yard, make a mercenary token. That's a really nice combo to do this all again. It spots you the mercenary token to sacrifice. So I like this card quite a bit. Baron Bertram Greywater. This is a 4-mana 3/4. This says whenever one or more tokens enter the battlefield under your control, you make a 1/1 rogue lifelink token. And it also has the ability 1 in a black, sacrifice another artifact or creature. You draw a card. This is a card we rated very low in the set review. And I think a lot of people were kind of surprised by it because it looks, kind of like it does some stuff. But it just got that classic problem I always talk about 4 mana, no enter the battlefield effect, no protection. I think this is not a totally unplayable card, but you shouldn't be drawn in to black-white for this card. You should be drawn into black-white for Ruthless Lawbringer, and I think this is a totally splashable card. Like, I've splashed this in my black-green decks quite a bit. I think overall, black-white is poorly positioned in the format, because what it's trying to do is grind out small edges, nickel and dime your opponent, like sacrifice a 1/1 for a little bit of value in a format where the other decks that are trying to grind out value, like black-green, are just going way over the top of you, right? So you're just trying to play a bit smaller of a game. Like, you're kind of bringing a knife to a gunfight, to be honest, when you're trying to play this, like, black-white grindy deck. I think it's a deck that you can draft if you think it's really open, you've got a lot of the premium cards. But unlike some of the better decks, it's not a deck that just works with commons and uncommons generally. Or at least, it's not a deck that works with mostly commons. I think you have to have a lot of uncommons and some good rares. Okay, so now some of the lesser decks in the format. We've got red-white, and I mentioned a few minutes ago how red-white aggro, there's not really much of a red-white aggro deck out there. I think if you had, like, a lot of the premium uncommon 2-drops, like there's the Coyote and the Roadrunner, those are both pretty good, like the 2/2 hasty things that both have kind of different abilities that help you attack. Or if you just had like a bunch of trained Airynxes, the 3 ones that you can saddle and get first strike, that's when I could entertain the idea of red-white aggro being good. But if you don't have 6, 7 good 2-drops, and like, again, those just don't really exist at common, and a red-white aggro deck isn't that viable. Now, it's gold cards, Eartha Joe, which is the 4-mana 2 red-white 2/4 that comes with a mercenary. And whenever you activate an ability that targets a creature or a player, you copy that ability. That card is great. That card is fantastic. Although I splash this card more than... I just haven't played red-white, to be honest, but I have splashed this card. And Form a Posse. This is the X green-white sorcery that you make X mercenary tokens. This is a green card in my mind. It's not a red-white card. And it's very good in the green decks. Like, if you're a green-white deck that maybe is a little bit like less of the mount aggro stuff, just kind of mid-rangey, this is a good splash. If you can form a posse for 5 or 6, it's a big stabilizing play that really starts to put a lot of pressure on your opponent. So I like these cards. I just don't think you should try to draft a red-white aggro deck. I could construct it, right? I could construct a red-white aggro deck with the cards in this set. It's not impossible. I just have a hard time imagining how you get into that deck. I guess you open like a Bruce Tarl, which is the good, awesome rare, that 2/4 that when it enters, you like exile the top card of your library, and if it's a land, you get an Ox, and if it's a non-land, you can cast that card until end of turn. And then like you just keep taking red-white cards, and you happen to see those premium 2s. Like if I open Bruce Tarl, I'm more looking to splash that card, or maybe be some sort of like red-white mid-rangey deck somehow. So I don't think red-white's unplayable. And I've been saying that for a lot of these. I don't think it's unplayable, but I do think you need to really consider what your deck is doing and what tools you have to get that job done. Because again, if you don't have 6, 7 2-drops that attack well, then you're just not an aggro deck. I'm going to talk about blue-whites, or just like blue control, when we get to some of the just blue cards in general. But the 2 uncommons here, Gem Lightfoot, which is the 4-mana 3/3 fighting vigilance creature that if you haven't cast a card from your hand this turn, you draw a card on your end step. And Wrangler of the Damned, which is the 5-mana 1/4 flash that has the same trigger condition, but you make it 2/2 spirit. I found these cards to be okay. I think, just quickly before we get into it in a few minutes, I think blue control is good, but very hard to draft and hard to play. I forced blue control last night, just kind of for science, in preparation for recording this episode. And in early access, also, I had a pretty good blue control deck. And I think there's something there. I think when I come back to the state of the format in a few weeks, I'll have more to say about it, because it's going to be a deck you're going to have to draft at some point when people realize the good decks are the good decks and you don't get them all the time. But just like most control decks, you need to build it in a way that reacts to the right threats and just gets kind of built right. Because if your control deck is built wrong, you're playing the wrong cards, either just like you're trying to put the wrong cards in your deck, or you accidentally put a card that just doesn't work in your deck, it can be a disaster. Like, if you're playing any other kind of deck, your cards, you're trying to be proactive. Sure, maybe a card doesn't line up very well against your opponent's blocker or something. It's not the end of the world. If you put the wrong kind of card in a control deck, it can be a disaster because you slip up once and your opponent just takes over the game. It's a very fine tightrope to walk unless you've got, a field wipe to reset the board. So there's something here, but I also wouldn't recommend just jumping into this unless you feel like you're a very good control player or you're just trying to explore this space. And then last deck here, which currently is the worst deck in the format according to 17 Lands, is Blue-Red. And Blue-Red, it's got a pretty simple problem, I think, and that is its creatures suck and its removal spells suck. Like, that's two pretty bad things, right? Like, if your creatures suck and your removal spells suck, why are you playing the deck, right? There's Slick Sequence, and this card is very good. This is the 2-mana red-blue instant that deals 2 damage to any target, and if it's the second spell you've cast, or if you cast another spell this turn, you draw a card, and it's also got Crom, which is the 4-mana 2/3 flyer, that when you cast your second spell each turn, you put a counter on it, draw a card. This card's not very good, just got the same Bertram Backwater, or whatever that card was called, the problem of 4-mana, no ETB issue. Now, if you can plot into this, like plot on 3, play this, cast your block card, draw the card immediately, okay, you kind of done your thing. But like I mentioned when talking about blue-green, it's kind of just hard to get a density of plot cards I've found. Just like blue-white, I think there is something here. It's just going to take a little bit of time. And if you are playing a blue-red deck, I would try to play it as a blue control deck with a bunch of counter spells and removal, rather than a red aggro deck with like blue tempo spells, because the red creatures generally aren't great at attacking, like we've been talking about this whole time, and the blue tempo spells also don't help supplement the plan that well. So I think out of all of this blue, red, and blue-white stuff, the best thing that it has going for it is the counter spells, is the leave all your mana untapped stuff. I think that stuff does work to some degree. I've had success, like I've drafted these decks about 3 times now, and I haven't trophied with any of them, but I've gotten like 5 wins, but by the skin of my teeth, I will say, like all very close games that if I slipped up once, it would not have worked out. Stay tuned. If you're brave, want to do some exploring, try to draft these decks, great. But I wouldn't recommend them if you're just jumping in for your first few drafts. All right, and then just to close out here, I want to go through each of the colors and just talk about maybe a few cards I didn't get a chance to talk about, some cards I've been impressed with. And if you're listening along, I'm just going to be talking about some cards. If you're watching along, I kind of pulled up for, a bit of additional content for the people watching on YouTube, just some of the cards that I do value in these colors. A lot of them we've already talked about. So, for example, here in green, I've got Throw from the Saddle, Snakeskin Veil, Patient Naturalist, Cactarantula on screen here, but we've talked about all of those. One thing I will say just quickly about Cactarantula and Spinewoods Paladin, which is the 5-mana 5/4 trample, plot 4-mana, ETB gain 3. Both of these 5s are good. Generally you don't have to value 5s all that highly, but I have found in this set, because it's a little bit slower, if you have to make the decision between more expensive cards or not, is a very un-Alex thing to say, but play more expensive cards, because the games do generally come down to a grind. Not all of them, again, some of them are just about good curve outs and one player stumbles, but if you have like 2 green mid-range decks going up against each other, you never want to be in a spot where you run out of action, where you stop doing things, where you play like on turn 5, you're like, well, I've got a defensive 2-drop to play, and my opponent's casting 6 and 7 drops, and they slam their good rare. You never really want to be in that spot. So I don't mind playing 6, 7, 5+ mana cards generally. That's definitely a fine place to be in your slower decks. 4 mana cards like Giant Beaver. That's another solid one too. Some cards I didn't get to talk about though. Dance of the Tumbleweeds. This one is pretty strong. It's a 2 mana spree card, 1 and a green sorcery. You can pay an additional mana to go to get a basic or a desert, put it onto the battlefield, untapped. Well, if it already comes in untapped. You can't get a tap land and have that come in untapped. But if you get a regular basic, it comes in untapped. And you can pay an additional 3 to create a XX green elemental token, where X is the number of lands you control. Yeah, this is a good green card. Just, you want it in your ramp decks. You don't want it in like your green, white mount decks by any means. But if you're there, yeah, it's a totally serviceable card. Harbristle Bandit is an interesting one. This is the 2 mana 1/1 plant rogue that taps to add a mana of any color. And when you commit a crime, you can untap it. That only triggers once per turn though. This card, I've been unimpressed with, and it's not that I dislike playing it, but I dislike playing it in certain decks. Because the games do go long, this card outstays its welcome pretty quickly. So you don't just want it as like, oh, a ramp tool in my green-black deck that is playing, this grindy mid-range game. You want to have cards in your grindy mid-range decks that are good draws on turn 7. You don't want to be drawing Harbristle Bandit. So I like this card when you're playing 4 or 5 colors because it offers you mana fixing that doesn't lock you into one color. I don't like it very much in just a green mid-range deck generally. Fine to play, but I wouldn't prioritize it. And then one last green card here, Tumbleweed Rising. 1 and a green for a sorcery. It's got plot for 2 and a green. You make an XX green elemental creature token, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. This is a pretty solid card too. If you've got somewhere in the neighborhood of, I would say 5, 6, 7 creatures that have 4 power or greater, yeah, I would play this card. I actually had an opponent that went Cat Tarantula into Tumbleweed Rising into Tumbleweed Rising, and I was like, oh, that was actually really good. Just tons of power and toughness the next turn. So yeah, this is a card that I have not minded playing. It looks a little bit dorky, it looks a little bit situational, but if you've got that 6, 7, 5, so 4 power creatures, then yeah, I'm happy to play the card. Moving on to black now. We've talked about a lot of the black cards as well. The 2 good removal spells, Consuming Ashes, which is the 4 mana exile something, Desert Stew, which is the 2 mana -2/-2 that scales for the number of deserts you control. There's Volt's Plunderer, which we didn't really talk about. It's the 3 mana 3/1 rogue that ETBs. You draw a card and lose a life, or target player. So if you really want to commit a crime, you can make your opponent draw a card and lose a life. Yeah, just a pretty solid card. And 2 cards I do really want to call out that are, I think, sneaky good are Ambush Gigapede, which is the 6 mana 6/2 flash that ETBs. Something gets -2/-2 until end of turn. And Fake Your Own Death, which is the 1 in a black instant. Target creature gets +2/+0, and you return it to the graveyard if it dies this turn, and you make a treasure token. So with the Gigapede, this is just a card I like to play in my black decks. It stabilizes you, kills a thing. If you're aggressive, if you're ahead, you can kill a thing, get in for an attack, and you're left with a 6 power creature. If you're behind, you flash it in, kill a 2 toughness thing, block another thing. It's pretty decent to reanimate. I think this is just a solid black common. I would be happy playing this at the top end, a copy or 2 in any of my slower black decks. And then, yeah, Fake Your Own Death. You care about all parts of this card, really. There's a lot of really good enter the battlefield effects, so just triggering those twice is really strong. The treasure token matters a lot of the time. And not a premium card by any means, but I've had a lot of draft decks where I kind of just gone, oh, this looks like a pretty good Fake Your Own Death deck. Let me try it out here. And I've got the Patient Naturalist, the mill 3, get a land back. Or even just the 2/2 lifelink in black, and you gain 4 life, and you get to get that back and trigger the, target yourself to mill yourself more, target your opponent to commit a crime. So just be on the lookout, I would say, for spots where this card is good. If you've got 8, 9, 10 creatures with good enter the battlefield effects. Ambush Gigapede, another pretty good one with Fake Your Own Death. So a card that I think is, being overlooked right now because people haven't really tried it out. There's a lot of good, powerful cards in the set, and this one might not stick out as much, but yeah, it's one I've been impressed with. All right, on to white now. And white, we've actually talked about most of the cards that I like in white. Mystical Tether, the removal spell, Trained Errands, the 3/1. A card that I ended up being a little bit lower on than I thought I might be is Holy Cow. This is the 3 mana 2/2 flying flash that when it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life and you scry 1. It's not a bad card. It's like a C, basically. I maybe expect you to be slightly better, like a C+, maybe even reaching in the B- range, but I just don't pick this card that highly. Right now, it's kind of funny. I actually only had 1 copy of it in my collection as I was bringing the cards in to MTGA here, and so I guess that just means people are drafting it higher than I am, and it's been fun. I've played it. I've been okay with it. My opponents play it. I'm like, okay, yeah, sure. Get a little bit of value. So not an inspiring Overseer level card for sure. There was some comparisons being made. Is this almost as good as inspiring Overseer? No, definitely not. It is just a fine playable. Vengeful Townsfolk. This is the 3 mana 3/3 in white that whenever 1 or more creatures you control dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Townsfolk. This card's been fine too. These cards usually are a little bit smaller. 3 mana 2/2s, 2 mana 1/1s, but starting at 3 mana 3/3, yeah, just about Holy Cow level. Maybe slightly worse. Bit better in a black-white deck where you're actively sacrificing things, but a card I'm not shy about playing. 2 cards I don't like in white are Ariet's Lullaby, which is the 2 mana sorcery, destroy target tap creature, you gain 2, and Steer Clear, the single white mana instant. Deals 2 to a target attacking or blocking creature, or 4 if you control a mount. I was talking up the mount deck, and I think that card is good. I just don't think this card is particularly good. The issue I have with both of these cards generally is that they don't really do a great job of answering the good rares. Some of the rares just don't need to attack or block to do their thing, and they kind of just sit there. So these don't really get rid of them. I mean, they're playable. None of these cards, most of the cards in this set, I don't think are absolutely unplayable. That's the thing with these new play boosters, and they're upping the power level of cards in general. It's very rare that it's just yeah, this card you should never put in your deck. I would just say if you're somebody who's been drafting these cards relatively highly, just bump them down a bit. Red is, it's tough. There's really not a lot of red commons I like here. I've got 3 in front of me. The kind of the 2 I like the most are Prickly Pear, the 3-mana 2/2 that comes with a Mercenary, and Irascible Wolverine, the 3-mana 3/2 that has Plot, 2 and a red. When it enters the battlefield, exile the top card of your library. You can cast it until the end of turn. And Deadeye Duelist, the 2-mana 1/3 reach that taps to deal damage to target opponent. This is definitely a committing a crime enabler. Don't just put this in any deck. But yeah, red's kind of struggling at common. Both these 2 3-mana creatures are good. A quick aside when talking about the Wolverine here, I just want to talk about the plot mechanic. Really haven't had too much time to talk about that during the rest of this episode. But if you look at the stats for basically all of the plot cards on 17 lands, they're not very good. Or at least lower than I would expect them to be. And you might think, okay, that means plot's bad. I don't think that's what it is, because I've been pretty happy with most of the plot cards. I think what's happening is that plot cards are difficult to play. And cards that give you options are always going to be a bit less good than they look on 17 lands, because anytime you have more options on a card, that's more room for somebody to make a wrong decision. And the option with plot, it's very skill testing, is like, well, is this game about value or is it about tempo? Should I just cast my Wolverine on curve? Or do I have time to plot it? People are going to make the wrong choice on that a lot of the time, right? Well, for example, I've seen people just play Wolverine after they play their land. And that's a simple mistake to make with this card, certainly. But I have found that plot really rewards understanding what the game's about. Now, that could mean that if you're somebody who thinks you have a little bit of trouble figuring out, oh, is this game about tempo or is it about value? They might perform about as they say on 17 lands for you. But if you're somebody who's like, no, I think I know my way around a game of limited Magic, I can make those decisions, I have a pretty good sense of that, then probably draft these cards a little bit higher than 17 lands might imply you should. And then finally, blue here. So I do want to talk about the little flash package or the don't cast spells on your turn stuff with the blue cards. Phantom Interference is another controversial card. This is the single blue mana instant spree card. You can tack on additional mana to turn into a counterspell unless they pay 2. Tack on an additional 3 to make a 2/2 flyer. I do still like this card. There's been some conversation around, well, this is bad when people are plotting because they cast a plot card with all their open mana, but they're also going to cast other cards that turn, right? You don't get to counter the plot card necessarily, but you can counter something else they play. And also, in a deck that uses Phantom Interference well, you've got a lot of other instants. So it's not a nightmare when they cast their card and you can't counter something, right? You just do something else. Or worst case scenario, you make a 2/2 flyer. So I have had success with these like all blue counterspell decks where you just have, almost all your cards are instants. You're using the Geyser Drake, the 3-mana 2/3 flyer that makes your spells cost less on your opponent's turn. And I don't think blue just has that much going for it at all at common or uncommon. Loan Shark is a solid card. This is the 4-mana 3/4 with plot for 4 mana. When ETBs, if you've cast 2 or more spells this turn, you draw a card. This card's awkward because it doesn't really go in the don't tap out blue decks, and I think those are the best blue decks. You just don't want to cast this card because you have to tap out early, basically. This is more of like a blue-green mid-range card, maybe. And it's a solid card, but it just doesn't really pair that well with the counterspell stuff. One card I want to call out that's an uncommon is Marauding Sphinx. This is 2 blue for a 3/5 Sphinx Rogue, Flying Vigilance, Ward 2. Whenever you commit crime, Surveil 2. This card's really, really strong. My blue control decks, I don't mind this as their finisher. If you're just like all counter spells and you're getting to the point of the game where you can cast this and leave up a counter spell to protect it. So this is actually one of the draws into blue. I wouldn't recommend getting into a heavy blue control deck again. Like I said, unless you just like want to explore this space early on in the format, or you do find yourself, you open up a really, really good blue rare, and you're like, hey, let's go for it. Like there's the rare spree counterspell. So like where some of the modes are like you pay 2 to draw 2 cards, discard a card, or pay 3 to make a token copy of something. That card's great. That's actually what got me into a blue deck recently. But like I mentioned, the margins are slim on these decks. If you have trouble playing blue control in general, you think in most limited formats, might not be the deck for you right now. But something to think about, and something that I do think is going to be part of the format as we get into it a few weeks down the line. And that's it. Yeah, I'm going to just stop it there for today. We talked about a lot. Thank you so much for watching and listening. I hope you enjoyed. If you're on YouTube, feel free to like and a comment and subscribe and all that good stuff. And yeah, we got a bunch of stuff to talk about in this format. It's a really deep format. I don't think I covered all of it today. Like, I definitely didn't cover all of it today. Kind of only scratched the surface. This is a very deep card pool for a format. We've got, 350 cards or something with all the bonus sheets. So, yeah, come on back next week, and we'll have some more good stuff. See you later, everybody.